everyone got to go to either Sydney or New Zealand for about a week, R&R.
Australians had pretty good beer.
We rented a house.
They fixed us up with pretty nice homes.
We filled it full of booze and strawberries and steaks and milk.
You know, the chow was good.
And everything we could get our hands on, and girls. And we had a royal party there for 10 days.
I went to Australia as a second lieutenant. I came back as a captain. The promotions were pretty fast then because we were losing a lot of people.
Well, yeah, we all hung out at the snake pit, and the snake pit was something else.
Well, the girls were hungry for companionship, which we provided, and the money, and the cigarettes, and the nylons, and all that stuff. That we had a ball with them. Boy, I came real close to marrying one of them.
Now, I wasn't married. My girlfriend had given up on me, and I met a girl there.
Her name was Anastasia, and I called her Anesthesia. She got a big boot out of that. But she was a real nice lady.
You'd have a little rest tour. That's the time when I met Pappy Boynton. He happened to be flying out of Vella La Vella the same time we were flying out of Bougainville, so he was back there at the same time we were. And he would always, somehow or other, he managed to get a hold of some liquor. I don't know how. And you know, he was an Olympic champion at Washington, University of Washington. So at about a certain time of the night when we were playing cards, I knew it was time for Mac Miller to slip out of there because he wanted to wrestle somebody, and I didn't want it to be me.
Yeah. He was a real character.
We felt almost the same about McGee as we did Boynton.
Chris McGee and I did a lot of flying together after we lost Pappy. And Chris McGee was just like Pappy.
He carried around all through the South Pacific a pair of hand barbells, and he'd work out every day. He was about 5'11" and 180 pounds, and he was all muscle, and he was ready to get in a fight anytime, especially in Sydney, Australia, where we had our R&R.
And then we had to pass the Snyder when we come back, and half of us couldn't pass the Snyder because we were chasing all the women in Australia.
And what's a Snyder?
Yeah, a Snyder is a physical exam to prove that you have all the conditions that you can fly that fighter plane.
322 had 40 airplanes, had 36 airplanes and 40 pilots. So there was some people going to have to go with the gear on an LST, and so we cut cards to see who was going. And of course, I got a deuce, and I got to go on the LST.
We were supposed to land on Guam on a certain day, but the enemy didn't like that idea very much.
When we first got in there, we were right in the middle of an air raid. Had to get out of transport and jump in a hole.
Here we are, 22 pilots over there, knowing nothing about anything except how to fly airplanes. We don't have any ground troops yet, so we had no engineering people, we had no gunnery people, no radio people, nothing. We didn't know anything about it. First thing we did was we managed to find a Japanese gasoline truck, fuel truck. And so we thought, aha, we can refuel. So we drove it over and started refueling the Corsair, and it was oil.
Went ashore, set up, and then the kamikazes started right away. We were getting bombs and everything else that goes with it.
Well, I was on a troop ship out in the bay when suicide blades were. That's why I say that's combat. You know, I was glad to get off that ship. I didn't actually see any diving toward me, but there were Japanese planes in the area diving at ships. And so you never know what ship they're going to pick out next.
This airplane that we have in the museum here, that one right there, as a matter of fact, George, was making a run on another ship, and he got hit. And so the executive officer and I were standing outside of the ready room, and all of a sudden we said, this guy's going to hit us. And he came down and went through our deck, and I think 7 people were hurt, but nobody was killed. And but we lost all our equipment.
There are a lot of stories about how
the Franklin, the Bunker Hill, you could list them. And sometimes they'd be burning out of control for a day or two or three,
Oh, horrible, horrible. And when they were on the ship, the Bunker Hill, they had no place to go when the two kamikazes hit her and killed 385 people. We lost 20 ground crews and 2 pilots. It was just a disaster. My God, it was awful.
A friend of mine was on the Bunker Hill, and he was about the 5th guy on the catapult. And he got launched, and the guy behind him didn't get launched. So I don't know. And bombs were going off. He said bombs were going off, and napalm was burning. And here they are trying to launch airplanes.
We were in the air, so we didn't see anything except the 2, a Judy and a Zero, diving on the ship. And man, we hollered like crazy that there were 2 kamikazes diving on her. And they didn't fire a shot until the first one hit and its bomb went off. And then the other one did a wing over and crashed into the side of the island. We circled around for a while, and then we realized that the ship was still underway, moving, and there were a lot of men in the water. So we dropped down and gave them our Mae West, our die marker, and our boats that we were sitting on, everything we could throw over the side to these guys. And I had 22 airplanes with me. And boy, we put a bunch of stuff in the water. I've had several people write to me and thank me profusely that we did that.
And how does that make you feel?
Oh yeah, God, it was something else. But we were finally ordered to land on the Enterprise because we were getting low on gas, and because we'd been on Okinawa chasing kamikazes. I had 22 airplanes, 2 F-6Fs and 20 F-4Us. We hollered like crazy for the deck to clear the deck, because we're coming aboard, we're low on fuel and whatnot. And so I landed. This guy came up and said, "Get out, get out, get out, get out, get out." And he promptly pushed my airplane, my F-4U-1C, over the side. Well, we lost 16 F-4Us over the side, because they didn't have room on the ship for their own airplanes. And oh man, but oh God, oh my God, you don't even give me the clock.
I tell you, the conversation was, I want to get off this blame thing before one of these guys lands on it. We had thousands of sailors killed on those things.
Practically every night. The kamikaze pilots would fly in from the west and try to break through the barriers of these ships, and there was just, the sky was filled with all sorts of fireworks.
And of course they would come into the island suicide planes too. We had one to land at Yantan, and they all jumped out and ran up down the strip, slicing up the planes and shooting out the tower, and you've probably heard that from this squadron.
We were trying to get some sleep in the holes, foxholes, and anyway, a big bright light went off way up high in the sky, and we all wondered what the heck that was. And there was an old timer there that had been out, in the Marine Corps for several years and had been in some prior campaigns, and when everybody was speculating about what had happened, why, he said, "We just got our picture took."
Tokyo Rose was on all the time, and she was always saying that the worst thing that ever happened to the Marines are going to happen X night. And one particular night, the air raid sirens went off, and the Japanese tried to bring in 4 Betty bombers. And not at our field, Kadena, but Yantan was right next to it. You could practically get over there without putting the flaps up. And they came in and tried to land on the field. And as they came in, the anti-aircraft stuff came down and followed them, so that the boys were practically shooting at each other across the field.
The Betty was loaded with kamikaze troops, and they landed wheels up on the runway, and that was kind of a harrowing night.
One of them was so badly boogered up during the landing that maybe he had 10 guys out of 30 that were able to do their job.
Tossed hand grenades into the Corsairs and busted a bunch of them up, a couple of other big planes.
And then those guys jumped out of the plane and just started running around and blowing up airplanes and blowing up fuel dumps and everything else. And it was so, the Japs weren't shooting at anybody. They was too busy tearing up airplanes, but everybody else was shooting, and you afraid to stick your nose up out of your foxhole, afraid to get shot by somebody else.
We all had guns, and we were shooting through our own airplanes, I'm pretty sure.
I just found me a hole, but while I was running away from one of the planes blowing up, a starter from one of the engines flew over my head and hit a hole up there, but I jumped in a foxhole and spent the rest of the night there while the bullets were whizzing over everybody's head.
And they destroyed about 2/3 of our airplanes.
I happened to have a BAR, and so they wanted me to get out to the front there and see if I could get a shot at these Japs with that Browning, and we didn't see any of them, but later on, this big bomber, or this plane that belonged to some high-ranking officer that had been parked up there, blew up and just went sky high, you know, and so we got on the alert more then to see if we could see who was out there blowing up the ordnance.
We'd raise up every once in a while, look around, and we'd see another airplane go up.
There was a lot of ordnance going off that night, you know, and so that, and the next morning, well, of course, all of the remains of the dead Japs and everything were out there on the strip. And
that went on to about daylight. It all ended. We got down there just about time light enough to see, and all the bodies was laying out there. The ones that hadn't got killed had committed suicide by holding a hand grenade and blowing themselves half in two, you know, and they laying out there on the ground. And
we were just glad that they didn't land 200 or 300 of them, and you know, because they really, I would say that the Japs had a pretty successful mission that evening. They destroyed a lot of our property, but they paid the ultimate price for it.
They landed fully expecting to be killed. It was a suicide attack, you know, kamikaze attack.
So it was a hell of a mess. We went over the next morning, and things were in really bad shape over there. But they achieved what they wanted to do. So it's the old going to a better land idea, you know. A number of them went.
We found out later that when these Japanese came in, that they had, some of them had pictures of the camp area and all of the Yontan airstrip, and they had taken that picture with that big phosphorus light that they blew up in the air that night from a high-flying plane.
Most of our missions over Japan were 5 and 6 hours.
One tank of gas to get to 12,000 feet to rendezvous those 20 airplanes that we were going up there with. And then you'd drop your tank. And then you'd take another tank, 160 gallons, to fly from Okinawa all the way up to Kyushu. And then you get up there and you drop. So then you're left with approximately 200 and some gallons inside, internal. And if you didn't have too bad of power settings, you could stay up there maybe 10, 15 minutes, you had to come home. But you'd have altitude, and so then you'd pay out your altitude and increase your ground speed.
Hops averaged 3.5 to 4.5 hours. Some long, the longest hop I flew was 8.7 hours. That was on an escort mission.
That is a long time to be sitting on a parachute. You sit sideways, back, raise up.
The runway, of course, was coral, flare pots, and the weather was bad with a lot of scud, low scud that we had to take off in.
And we flew in all kinds of weather. We didn't have lights. We'd take off some mornings early before daylight.
Either a pre-dawn, we relieve night fighters on station. You take off pre-dawn, relieve the night fighters.
And have to rendezvous on the planes in front of us, seeing the exhaust stacks.
You had a lot of night landings, a lot of night takeoffs, and with flare pots and hard rain, and it was an experience. Each takeoff was an experience. So.
They had scheduled a massive strike. I believe the city is Kogashima. There's a Kogashima Bay or something in southern Kyushu, and there's supposed to have been 500 Japanese kamikaze planes waiting for good weather to come down and make one massive kamikaze raid on ships and fields and everything else.
Big shots told them, well, we got to find out if we can get through before these kamikazes take off.
We just got to get this right off if we possibly can. Those boogers are going to kill us if the weather breaks and they send all those planes out. We need somebody to make a weather hop. And we took off, I suppose, about 3:30 in the morning, black as a mischief. And daylight came, we were well on our way, and I looked over as soon as I could see the other plane, and number 4 didn't have a belly tank. So I had to order them to go back.
And we went up and down from the ground, or from the water to 25, 30,000 feet, and couldn't get over, under, couldn't go around. It was a terrific front to cross there.
I think we were probably within 20 miles of possibly 30 of Kyushu then, where this thing. And I told Bert the other day, I said, I hope we're smarter than that now. I said, I'm smarter than that now, Bert. That was a foolhardy thing. But it had to be done. Somebody had to do it.
Colonel Hammond and I really enjoyed talking about that. He said, I couldn't shake you, could I? I said, you weren't about to shake me, because I was up there 300 or 400 feet, 300 or 400 miles from home, and I wasn't going to let you leave me.
Chief Lou, I was his wingman, and we were coming back from just the two of us. I forget, I think we'd been escorting Dumbo to search for a downed pilot or something. Anyway, a line squall came back between us and the base, so we had to get right down on the water, and we kept on flying, and I could see we were running out of gas, and I kept thinking that we should ditch in the water while we still had enough power that we could sort of control our let down into the water rather than just dead stick into one of those big swells. But Chief kept on going, and I thought, well, I'm his wingman. If we're going to drown, we'll at least drown together. But at the last minute, we passed over a little strip of coral, and there was an abandoned airstrip on that. And so we went in and landed, and Chief Lou, the only comment he ever made then or ever about was, he said, getting kind of low on gas, eh, Georgie? I think our planes coughed their last just as we landed.
They had us in that squadron doing some crazy night flying too. We had to take off like at 2:30 in the morning to be in a certain place to try to find the Japanese float planes that were harassing our PT boats. And this particular night, oh, it was horrible. It was lightning and thunder and then rain in torrents. And I said to this same major, I said, we're not going to try to take off in this stuff, are we? I said, we'll never get joined up. And we never did get joined up on them.
8 of us took off to fly over Bougainville and to help out the Mud Marines that were still fighting down there and help them in any way we could. We took off, and after about 10 minutes, we hit the storm. It got black as night, and the violence of it you wouldn't believe. That Corsair was tossed all around. The first thing I found out, I looked at my instruments, and there I was in a dive to the left, going almost straight down, losing altitude. And I righted it right away, leveled it out, stayed on instruments for a minute or two, and I looked at them again, and there I was in that same attitude. And I did this 3 or 4 times, losing thousands of feet of altitude each time. Well, the last time I broke out right over the water, and I saw the sun shining. So I got out of the storm, I went under it, and I flew on to Bougainville. I figured, well, the rest of the fellas are having the same problem I am. They'll probably meet me up over Bougainville. Well, I got over Bougainville, nobody showed up, and I patrolled the area for an hour, and I got nothing on the radio where the Marines down below needed help. So I flew back, only to find out that the rest of the fellas got hit with the same storm, but they turned around. They didn't fly through it.
These storms would come up in the Ryukyu Redo that we were flying up and down, which is a string of islands that attaches Okinawa to Japan. Well, weather coming home so many times was so bad. Okinawa was, if I remember correctly, about 111 feet. So we had our altimeter set for 0 at 111 feet. And I remember coming home one day when I was looking for somebody and couldn't find them. And I remember coming down through the clouds, flying instruments, and breaking out of the clouds below 0. And I mean to tell you, you're sort of mushing her in then.
But as far as navigational aids, we had just an old beam. They had a beam that you could navigate, but it was awfully hard.
We had the YEZB back at the home base, and we could always tune in and come home with that.
Had a rig that was supposedly transmitted some signals that would give you a zone in which you were and where you're heading to fly back to base, but that never worked. But it was all dead reckoning and by the seat of your pants and hoping you knew where you were in reference to the maps that you had on your knee pad. It was tough.
But it was mainly just dead reckoning navigation.
Lee Tatro, Bob Dodson, Al Kreuzberg, and myself went to flight CAP, Combat Air Patrol, over a picket boat. There was a layer of cloud between about 15,000 and 25,000 feet, and we were above it. We were at 35. And I got a nitrogen bubble in my shoulder, and I couldn't move my fingers. And we didn't know at that time if you just dropped down 1,000 feet, you'd take it out. So they sent me home. And the other 3 stayed up about half an hour longer, and Leo said, "We got to go." He was our division chief. And so they gave him the same vector. They were 190 miles north of Okinawa, which was beyond the range of this YG, right out into the blue Pacific. And luckily the Yorktown picked him up 120 miles out and vectored him in. And they kept telling Leo, well, you're either going to have to bail out or water land. He says, I don't want to do either one of them. And that we've been operating off a strip at Okinawa there. That was 2,800 feet long and 65 feet wide, day and night with a full load. And he convinced them. And so they gave him a guy with the radio, with the flags, and a guy with the radio. And they never saw the guy with flags. All 3 caught the 3rd wire. The only problem they had, Leo, when you land on the carrier, the tail wheel, you disengage it, so it's free swinging. So if you land off to one side, you don't do any damage. Well, he forgot that. And he landed a few feet off to one side and just snapped it off. And I mean, it's a 10-minute fix. He had 10 gallons of gas, and the other 2 guys had 5. So you know how many wave offs they could have taken? None.
I was with the VMF 113 Squadron from Ieshima and had been out on a mission, and for some reason, when we started back, I got separated a little bit from the rest of my group, but somebody called in on my number, said, this Red 4, this is, come in please. Well, Red 4, I recognized as the number Kenneth Walsh had called me in his training group. I was the number 4 person in that group. And Walsh had been a Medal of Honor winner from Guadalcanal. So Walsh said, switch to such and such a channel, another channel, Red 4, and we can talk a little bit. And I did. And I got to talk to him quite a bit. Walsh told me who he was and where he was from, and he said, I'm out here again too. Okay. He says, and I know where you are. But he says, you ever get a chance to come over to my squadron, to my side, he says, you come on down. He said, I'll have a warm beer for you. I thanked him very much. And when we landed, then a few minutes or a half hour later, back at my airfield, the whole squadron was out there to greet me. They all knew that name, Kenneth Walsh. Was that really Kenneth Walsh? Oh yes, that was him, my good friend.
It was the mission that Pappy Boyington was shot down. As we took off, right away I found out my radio wasn't working. And that happened frequently, and we would use hand signals in the air. You hold your nose and shake your head and point to your plane. That means I'm having trouble with my plane. Or you would tap your head and point to your wing man, and that means I'm leaving, you stay with the division. Well, we got up close to Rabaul, and it came time to test our guns. And I went to test mine, and they would not fire. And I did everything I knew how to try and get these guns to fire. Now I got a decision to make. Am I going to go ahead with this? Within 10 minutes, we're going to be over Rabaul, and we're going to be in a heck of a dogfight with the Zeros. I went like this to my wingman, pointed to my plane. He knew I was having trouble with my plane. I turned the lead over him to stay with the division. And I pulled out of the division, and now I find my compass wasn't working. So I had to take a guess. Now I got 250 to 300 miles back to home base. So I took a guess at the wind condition and the waves on the Pacific, and I just took a guess at how to get back home. And I flew, and I flew, and I flew. I was getting low on fuel, and I'm looking down, nothing but the blue Pacific, and I think, this is it. I'm not getting out of this, because whether I land the plane or bail out, I'll end up in a rubber boat, and I won't last long in a rubber boat. There wasn't an island in sight. And I was resigned to say, this is the end of my career. When with that, a Corsair flashed in front of me. Here was my wingman, who knew I was in trouble, and he wasn't going to let me go down unless he could radio back and tell the rescue crews where to find me.
What was his name?
And his name was Al Johnson. So he flew in front of me, he realized I was lost, gave me the join up signal. We made about a 90-degree turn to the south, and within 15 minutes we were at home base. But if Al Johnson hadn't done that, I wouldn't be here talking.
They gave us what they called an E6B, which was a sliding plexiglass with a circular disc on it with concentric circles. And you could plot the ship's course and theoretically your course on that. And then, of course, when you got into a fight, nobody paid any attention to what direction they were headed in. Being aboard ship, the terrain was all very similar, but they did have a thing called ZB, which sent out omnidirectional signals, and they changed that every 4 hours, so you'd have to memorize these 16 different digits, and then the next 16 digits, and if you'd pick that up on your radio, and you could home in on the ship that way, if you could pick it up.
It's quite a strong airplane. I've seen them come back with half the tail movable, with part of the rudder gone, holes in the wings. We got shot at almost every night coming back over the fleet.
We got shot at a lot by the Navy, of course.
One day we were going out to Mamioshima, which was the northernmost area covered by the radar picket patrol out of Okinawa. 3 of the other people in my division started the airplane real well, and off they went. So I was sitting there having problems starting my plane. So I'm very late. I get off maybe 5 minutes late, and I'm approaching this Navy picket patrol. The fighter director from the destroyer calls me, and he said that, bogey, there's a bogey on our screen, there's a bogey coming in from the south. So I called in, I said, I'm coming in from the south too. And he said, well, keep your eyes open, that guy is somewhere near you. So I charged my guns and start looking around for a Japanese, some sort of bogey. And all of a sudden, I get within the range of the ships, the sky turns black, blood doom. I was the bogey. And what had happened was that when the radar picks a friendly plane up on its screen, the plane sends a recognition signal, called it the cockerel. And the word was, keep your cockerel crowing. And boy, they opened up on me, and I pulled around and away, started screaming, you're shooting at me, you're shooting at me. And he said, make your cockerel crow. And I checked it, and it was on, it just wasn't working. Thank goodness they weren't any more accurate. I'd have been blown right out of the sky.
We'd be on an instrument type flight, and we'd drop down through the clouds and come down, further down, further down, further down. Finally, we'd be out over the ocean looking at a whole bunch line of destroyers, and all of a sudden they started to light up, and look out, let's go back up in the clouds.
We'd be 5,000 feet, and when we went past Aishima, and on a certain heading to take us down to Yantan. So they knew that if you were at that altitude and on that heading, that you must be friendly. They shot at us anyhow.
The day before Christmas in 1943, we had to cover a task force. This was my third time over them that day. I had 3 missions in one day there. And they put some anti-aircraft fire up there. This is after our planes had been over them all day, because when we weren't there were other planes there. And so we registered a complaint, and well, the admiral got in the act, and he sided with us, and we got an apology from the captain of the task force. He said that they hadn't shot the guns for so long, they thought they ought to shoot, and they didn't realize they were putting the bullets or the anti-aircraft fire so close to us. Oh man, I thought, wow, what an excuse. But that was a shock.
We had good experience. There was good experience for later on bombing, because we learned how to use the Corsair as a dive bomber, and it hadn't been used much before. It was mainly as a fighter, but you could drop a 1,000-pound bomb or 2,000-pound, and it was a beautiful airplane for doing that.
The plane, as you see it right now, has 2 drop tanks. They're 150 gallons each. It has 8 5-inch rockets, 6 50 caliber guns, 2,400 rounds of 50 caliber.
And we could carry up to 2,500 pounds of bombs.
We would sometimes have 2 belly tanks of napalm. Sometimes we would be loaded with just the rockets and ammunition if we were going to be strafing. So it depended on what our mission was and how our airplanes were armed.
It was something that was big mass of opposition, or it was a side of a mountain where they were dug in, we'd use bombs. If we had something a little bit more specific than that, we could use the rockets. And the 5-inch rockets were pretty accurate. And then if it was really troops attacking our troops, we would primarily use the 50 calibers. And as I say, we carried 2,400 rounds, which is we couldn't fire them all at one time. We'd burn up the barrels, but you fire in bursts.
I remember the first time I did it. We were on a mission out of the canal, and we're up at altitude, and Bob Owen says, okay, test your guns. Well, I had flown the airplane. We'd done a little bit of gunnery before, and every time we did our gunnery, we were firing just one gun. This time I'm firing all 6 at one time. And so he says, test your guns. I turned on all 6 switches and pulled the trigger. It was quite an eye-opener.
You'd be on a strafing run or something like that. You'd fire those 6 machine guns and you could feel the airplane slow down from the recoil. Just a measurable feeling.
And then, of course, if you fired all 6 guns at one time, that's when it really shook. When you fired all 650s at one time, actually slowed you down a little bit.
I'll tell you what, when you fired all 6 at one time, they rattled that airplane. Boom.
It would cut a boxcar in two.
I had an F4U-1C with 4 20-millimeter cannons on it. It was the only one the ship had. And I just loved that airplane. God, the firepower was incredible. We didn't have the length of time of firing as we did with the 50 calibers, but it came close. They put longer trays on it because there were two less guns in the Ford rather than the 650s.
Maybe the 650s were a little better for air-to-air, but the 420s were a little better for air-to-ground.
You could sure feel the guns going off. Man, it was something else.
Those are the 20s?
Yeah, the 20s. Oh, God. They'd rattle your cage, to say the least.
If you had 3 guns that would not fire and one would fire, you could not fire one shot without having the whiplash moved off your target. You could not hold it onto the target with your rudder.
The yaw of the aircraft.
Yeah, so much that you could not hold it on it. Even if it was your right one and you fired it, the airplane was going to yaw to the right. And even if you pointed your nose 10 or 15 degrees to the left, you fire that first shot and immediately you're over here.
They had developed a supply of depth charges. And they decided that they would get rid of these by dropping them as bombs. We had a problem with them in that the fins on them had a round circular covering around the fin.
They were round instead of having a convex place in them, and so we had to take a hammer and beat those in to where they would fit up under the plane.
And our method was to take 9-pound sledgehammers and beat the stupid fin into shape so it would fit up there.
I didn't really cotton pounding on a bomb with a hammer.
And you can imagine what that's like, a several 100-pound depth charge you're pounding on with a sledgehammer.
On Okinawa, in the latter part of the campaign, we dropped a lot of napalm, and that was touchy stuff. Had to handle it pretty carefully in the way we armed it and everything, and I always hated to see it come back. I didn't like to handle it, and defuse it.
They had big metal tanks, about 6 foot square, I think they were, that they originally designed to hook together to make piers out of. But these were hollow. Now, what would happen when we loaded a napalm strike was a lowboy would bring up 2 of these tanks filled with the 2 components.
You'd try to get the napalm fixed an hour or so before you took off, because they would stir up the soap and into the gasoline so that it would gel.
And they would set up a gasoline pump with hose running from that, and we would pump that stuff into the auxiliary gas tanks. And then when we filled them, we put the cap back on and then taped a phosphorus hand grenade to the side of the tank, pulled the pin and put an arming wire in it. Real sophisticated professional. But that's an example of the kind of things that quite often were done.
In the wintertime, they would sometimes drop and not torch off, so the 20 millimeter had HE rounds. The guy coming behind you, might be going to set it off if it didn't go.
Occasionally we would shorten the time on the fuses, by running them by hand for so many revolutions, because they had discovered a target that they wanted to go in low over. They wanted a quick explosion on.
There were several rings in here, and along the diagonals they had vertical, horizontal, then they had 2 at 45 degrees. And those were marked off in mills. And we could sight with those. You didn't have to, like the old gun sight, where it was just like a scope on a rifle. You didn't have to be exactly straight on it. You could be off to one side.
You can see when you strafe, when you can see dust fly, and when you're after a small boat or something like that, you can see your projectile splash in the water, and you can see the convergence, you know.
You would guess your distance, and then you would correct by raising so many mils for that distance. And it was the same way when you were shooting an airplane, that you would know that you would have learned as much as you could about the airplane as to what its speed was and how to recognize at certain angles. And by that and distance, you would put so many mils in front of it, because you see so many pictures of it almost looks like a garden hose, that they're aiming right at it and they'll never hit it that way because it's always behind. And so we could use that not only for the air-to-air gunnery, we could use it for the rockets. As I say, the fives were pretty good, pretty accurate, and also with the machine guns. Our 6 machine guns were bore-sighted. They would come together 1,000 feet in front of the airplane.
The preferential distance from the end of your guns to your target was about 1,000 feet, because that's when they were bore-sighted for both the guns to cross out there at 1,000 feet. And if you're farther away than that, you didn't have a very good opportunity of all 4 guns hitting the target.
We didn't use that gear down business because one thing, we wanted to get in and out of the thing as fast as we could. So we would roll over, we'd go into from our normal squadron formation, we would get in a line, and we would all come up, and it's like doing a split S on the target. So when you're in your dive, you're almost vertical.
Just from experience, you'd have to know what settings to put on your trim tabs so it would be easier to go in.
We'd start at 10,000 feet, and we would release before about 3,000 and be out before 1,000 feet. Now, with everybody, it's a little bit different. Some guys held on a little longer.
Your glide angle coming in for a bomb was a lot steeper than it would be if you're coming in for strafing. And you had your gun sight, and you would, depending on the speed that you'd be coming in at, you'd have your gun sight. And of course with tracers, if you missed the first one, you just walk your tracers up to your target and then try to keep your guns on that target for as long as you could before you had to pull up and go.
You'd spot your target on the ground and circle to come in the best way. And generally, if you're firing rockets, you fired 2 at a time.
And just roll in, and the easiest way to roll in was to roll on your back and go down, and then come out in a steep dive and put the pipple where you estimate it should go, and fire rockets. You could only fire them 2 at a time, because if you salvoed all of them, you'd just about tear your plane up.
We could fire the rockets either in salvo, or we could fire them 2 at a time. And you could, by clicking the proper switches, you could come up with that solution. And you use the same, on top of the stick, there was a button that we used for that. The trigger on the front was for the guns.
We just used the fixed gun sight, and we carried them in fairly close and pickled them off.
Fantastic gunnery platform. It just flew. It was so stable in the change of airspeeds, so easy to trim. Of course, you had to keep your needle ball to hit the target. You had to have it. You had to have it in trim.
This was just strictly so that you knew about what their fall was at a distance. They fell once they got out about beyond 1,000 yards. They dropped off pretty rapidly. So we would try and add what we figured was enough windage to it to take care of that.
Close air support is really in those days, that's one of the things that the Marines were just extremely well practiced at. The the Marine Corps had trained us for close air support pretty well.
We used the close air support for the Army. When we went from Bougainville to the Philippines, we were transferred basically from the Navy to the Army. So we were doing Army work as well as Navy work, because all of a sudden the food wasn't as good, but we did get an ounce of whiskey every day from the Army. So that made up for some of that. All of a sudden they found out we could talk to them on the ground, and they gave us permission, like we would go do an escort for the Navy, and flying back home, they'd come up the Army with and said, hey, can you help us? So Dick and I would say, well, hell yeah, we got all our ammunition. And so we'd go down and they'd say, hey, we're at this roadblock right down here, and there's a Y on the road, and he says, right in that Y there's a Japanese pillbox. So we'd come down there and just strafe the heck out of it, shoot up all our ammo, and then go home. And the Army found out we'd do this, and we thought it was a good deal. We liked to do it for them.
One of our pilots was a forward air controller, and we did a lot of ground support flights with the Marines. And it gives you the feeling of that you're doing something to help shorten the war.
Well, we'd take off on a pre-dawn takeoff, and the Japanese didn't have radar that we knew of. They had some watchers on these islands that would give them information. But we'd fly up on the deck, and right on the deck, and about half a mile from the field, the enemy field, we'd pull up to about 1,500 feet, and then nose over and come down and strafe their airfields and hit their parked aircraft alongside the airfield. And most of the time we were able to catch them by surprise.
Come in as low as you could and just pop up over the trees to strafe them so that you weren't visible for too long. But they had very good anti-aircraft fire.
One of the first missions where we actually fired the guns was that we went in and supported the ground troops on Bougainville. And they had placed these big white arrows on the beach. And they were being harassed by the Japanese mortar fire. And this is where we were to strafe. So we went there at the break of day and came in off the ocean and fired all our guns until we went back at them until we had all the ammunition was gone. But what really floored me on that particular thing is, I don't know if these were white cockatoos or what, but with the first burst of bullets that went in there was just a cloud of white birds came up. And you could see some of the bullets were hitting them, you could see them flying, but the ground forces indicated that they found 106 dead Japs after our strafing runs there.
Out of a fighter squadron of F-4U Corsairs, two or three flights would be bombers and be loaded with several 500-pound bombs. Another group may have 5-inch rockets. And their function, one would be to bomb, one would be to rocket. We also used a lot of napalm, which was a big fire bomb that came out of a jettisonable fuel tank. So then you'd have the fighters that weren't carrying anything. Their prime job was to protect the others. So we functioned as planes other than fighters frequently.
Corsair was such a fantastic airplane for everything. A great dive bomber, great strafing. My favorite armament was the 5-inch HVR, the 5-inch high velocity rocket. It was the rocket that you could put your target right on the pipper, punch it, and it'd go right in the cave, right where you want it. That's so great for close air support, which Marines did so much of. They'd get target identification, put the pipper on the target, let it go, and the guys down on the ground was just man, they just loved us. They just loved us because we could get right in close with them.
We'd carry the one 500-pound bomb because, like, we would go up to Rabaul and say a group of us, 70-some Corsairs would go up with 70 SBD dive bombers, and the dive bombers would dive down to hit the target, and they'd hang a bomb on each of the fighters, and then we would be weaving as we went down, and we would just drop our bomb on the outside of the weave. And the whole purpose of that was just to cause havoc with the gunners that were shooting. So they just felt we were making them nervous. and it worked.
And then we'd go into a dive on that target, and halfway down in the dive, the ground pounders would throw out a William Peter, white phosphorus grenade. That was what we put our pipper by. That's what we aimed our bombs to and everything. We did this with about a 45-degree dive. And we'd either close up that tunnel, or we'd drop napalm on it and just burn everything in sight around it. And it was nice to hear them call us up and say, thanks, fellas.
We would go there and be available on call for missions of opportunity. And that's when the forward air controllers would come into play, or they would do other times too. But they'd come into play, and you'd know your communications were up, and you report in and say, oh yeah, hey, we got a target, And then they'd tell us where the target was, and actually direct us, like, well, okay, do this, do that, and okay, drop your bomb, see? And but not often. Usually we found the target and could do it with the eyeballs.
The fact is that we never had any practice with the Corsair. Of course, with the old F4F Wildcat, we had, practice with dummy bombs and that kind of thing, and with the SNJ, which we trained in. But the Corsair, we never had any practice, so they sent us to wipe out this little bridge on a road to harass the Japs more than anything. The three guys that came back that were ahead of me to bomb said they had direct hits on the bridge. Well, I had news for them. When they interviewed me, he said, how'd you do? The bridge wasn't there anymore. I said, the bridge is still there. I said, at least I hit the road. I said, those guys put theirs out in the jungle. I said, the bridge is still there. And that was quite, he didn't want to believe that those other guys had lied to him, but they did.
But I'll tell you one thing, we didn't hit targets like these guys hit them today. I can remember going up on some strikes to hit some targets that, I hate to admit it, but that eight or so of us would miss, and we'd have to go back and till we finally got them, because we had no automatic gun sights whatsoever. Our gun sight was about as sophisticated as the gun sight on your shotgun.
I like to fly the morning hawk. Being an enlisted pilot, I helped ordnance load the plane the night before, and the next morning we took off just before daybreak. And we put enough ordnance and stuff on that Corsair so in the mornings with the humidity, we were leaving contrails off both wingtips as we lifted off.
Okinawa and Iwo, Iwo Jima, we dropped napalm and low-level strafing and whatnot.
Then we'd also have strike assignments down to the Miyakos and up to Kyushu. We'd make strikes into the shipyards and that sort of thing, kind of routine. The Marines didn't get a lot of those, but we had enough of them.
We would fly sometimes 2 and 3 close air supports in a day, depending on the intensity of the ground action at the front lines.
We would bomb strafe within about 200 feet to 200 yards in front of the troops, drop bomb.
They had panels laid out with interim smaller panels in between maybe a 200-300 yard space there. So we knew that they were there and the Japanese were just the other side of that.
Generally, they had red panels, but that sometimes didn't work too well because the North Koreans found out about it and they'd put out red panels of areas we're not supposed to hit.
We were flying south, past the Shuri line, the Naha area, and the infantry troops would lay panels. And this is critical that the fighter pilot know, or the pilot know, who's friendly and who's not friendly. And so we had all of that working real well, and they had done a beautiful job of lobbing a couple of phosphorus shells into these caves that we were using napalm and rockets on primarily. And this day we were to use rockets, and we came in on that cave We were flying at 45 degrees. We'd been trained so well that I could have flown 45 degrees in my sleep upside down. And we came in, and you fire your machine guns first because the tracers show you whether you're on the target or not. And we were knocking the devil out of those caves. So I said, well, I'm a salvo my rockets. In other words, fire all of them at once. And I hit that switch, and shoo, I looked down, there was no rocket in front of me at all. The rockets barely had enough power to get off the rails on my airplane and fell down. Of course, I hate to think of what we probably did some troops that time. So I've never seen the Marine Corps move as fast as they did with that problem. The propellant charge for these 5-inch rockets had been encased in cardboard. And there had been some dampness that had gotten into some of them, and it just ruined the propellant charge. Within 2 weeks, and I kid you not, it was fast, the next group of propellant charges that came out for the 5-inch rockets were in sealed tinfoil, and they functioned fine. We had never had a problem with rockets again. But this is a case of what can happen. Unfortunately, these kind of things affect our own troops, and this is not what we have in mind, or what we were trained for.
Big Trigger, not Baby Trigger. They're both two brothers in that squadron, 224. And he and I were out doing this targets of opportunity, and we just happened to hit, it sounded like a farmhouse, or looked like a farmhouse to us, and it was an ammo dump. And that thing, when I went over it, I was leading it. And when I went over the top of that thing, it must have blown me another 500 feet at least in the air right above it. But everything was still working, you know.
We were a bunch of old men, and we were flying these Corsairs, which were just beat up wrecks. I think the reason they had Korea so they get rid of all the war material left over from World War II.
The later F-4s, the F-4UB4, which I flew in Korea, of course, was an improvement in many ways. But it was still a Corsair. Still, it was an old airplane then, but it did its job. It really, we could do what we had to do then, which was support the ground Marines. And we did a hell of a job of doing that. We had nearly a year of very active training at El Toro, Marine Corps Air Station El Toro, in 1949, when the armed forces had been cut and cut and cut and cut. And they were cut down after World War II, had to be, but now we were getting to being just skeleton forces. But we were able to fly a lot, and we did fly a lot. So when Korea broke so suddenly, VMF 214 was absolutely at the top peak of readiness to do what it turned out to have to do.
It took some transport pilots and others out there with us. They didn't have time to transition to carrier duty. One old boy, he qualified just flying back from missions, you know, one by one.
Captain Thatch being an aggressive guy, and there's a war on, and he said, well, let's get moving. So he got 8 aircraft loaded with some bombs and rockets, and of course our 420 millimeter guns now instead of 650s, and launched. And I led that first launch of 8 aircraft, which was the first Marine combat action of the Korean War. But we saw boxcars and vehicles, and we strafed and bombed them.
The carrier was based in Sasebo in conjunction with a British carrier, the HMS Glory. And we would go out and we'd be on the combat section for 9 days. And it would take a day to go from Sasebo to the combat area, which was southwest of Pyongyang-do Island in North Korea.
Captain Thatch was alone except for one destroyer, a plane guard destroyer. So as soon as we struck that late afternoon at Sinbani and some other place, and then he turned the ship west around the southern part of Korea, and then for the next 3 days, just us were fighting the North Koreans. We would take off and find targets of opportunity up around Seoul, went even up to Pyongyang.
They pushed us pretty hard there.
He was an aggressive guy, and he had an outfit that could do the job, so he put him to it.
We were down around the Naktong first, and in the Naktong perimeter. We were called on to hit troop gatherings and the people crossing the river, the North Koreans crossing the river down there. And they said the river ran with blood there, strafing and going on.
Felt sorry for those poor guys on the ground because they were being attacked, and it's raining and misting, and one flight in particular I felt real good about, because after we started dropping ordnance through the fog, and we had to go make sure we were far enough away from our own troops. And then each one of us, as we made our pass, we'd fire and drop 250-pound bombs. And when we got close enough to the front lines where we were dropping really close, I was the number 4 pilot, and forward air controllers said, move it in just a little. Well, how much is just a little? But I dropped my napalm and stuff and peeled off, and we joined up to head back home. The forward air controller said, that was close enough. He said, our own troops could feel the heat of that one. And he said, North Koreans started running back down the mountainside. So he said, we broke up the attack. I felt good about that.
I told the guys flying with it, I said, I see where that nest is. You want me to go down and get it? He said, no, we'll go take care of the primary target that, that we had been briefed on the carrier. So we did. So after we finished that, he said, you think you can find that? I said, I'm pretty sure I can. So we went back up there, and I had it spotted. And so I told my wingman that I was going in on it and for him to follow me on it. So I was halfway down my dive, and my bullets were sprinkling all around that thing, and the people that were manning it were running up the hill. So I told my wingman, there they go up the hill, get them. And about that time I pulled out and the machine gun nest blew up.
We had the closest coordination with the ground needs, and then we could therefore satisfy their needs. And it became a religion or a crusade for us, because we could see what they were facing, and it was tough.
We had a raid on the Japanese battleship, which was on a suicide mission, the Yamato. And boy, Jesus, boy, she was shooting her main batteries at our torpedo planes, and they'd splash up like that, and the torpedo planes would keep right on boring in. They were doing a great job. And we would strafe the smaller ships around the periphery of the battle group, and they let the torpedo planes come in, and boy, they bore the full brunt of the main batteries, because they'd put up a horrendous splash. I think they were 17-inch guns.
We were loaded with small bombs, and we started our peel off for dives at 15,000 feet. We were about 1,500, 2,000 feet apart. And I could see the airplane ahead of me. Suddenly it disintegrated. We don't know what happened for sure, but we believe he was hit by an artillery shell in mid-flight.
And when we went to Rabaul, we'd fly the squadron up. We usually go in 4-plane sections, or divisions we called them that time. And we'd start out at some place on Rabaul and strafe from one point to another, like Put-Put to Karavat or something. And we'd carry us a 1,000-pound bomb and drop it if we found something that looked good, and then strafe anything as we went by. We never, in those days, never made a second pass, because by then the Japanese gunners, anti-aircraft gunners, would be ready. So we just didn't do it.
We did lots of ground attacks on Guadalcanal for a few days, and for a great number of days on when we were operating off a carrier, but didn't have much resistance. In fact, I flew from over Tokyo all the way to the other coast on China and back, and never saw one Japanese aircraft in the air. And I really wondered about that.
The Japanese were supplying the islands in the string of islands between Okinawa and Japan. They'd bring these small ships in at night to these volcanic islands, and then they'd drape camouflage over them.
The Japanese still had them at the end there, and they'd use them to go between islands and so on. And it was just shooting and sort of like shooting fish in a barrel.
We went out on a strike that was to sink or destroy these old wooden vessels, primarily wooden vessels that the Japs were using to reinforce their islands with. We didn't consider that so noteworthy that we recorded much of anything, except I can tell you we sank a lot of them.
It was something that the Air Force could not take care of. You know, it was pretty desperate. They had a bridge. We think we had Mishner aboard ship, and that was part of the story of Toko Ray. Who knows, you know? But we went in there, and I was able to put a 1,000-pound bomb on it, and I got the DFC for that. It was pretty heavy flak.
We were about to take Seoul. I had a flying sergeant flying with me on this. I found a tank in an alleyway, and I marked it. The sergeant got a direct hit with a 500-pounder on the tank and just left it a puddle of oil burning.
It depended to a degree on what the target was as to the tactics you would use. We had rockets, anti-tank rockets, and you would fire them standing off up here somewhere.
Fellows in the squadron would fly a patrol over the area for part of the day, because he could spot what they were talking about. Then he'd go in with a phosphorus rocket to mark the target, and then we would make a run on that.
We did a lot of strike missions like enemy airfields. And I'll tell you something else that I find very interesting that I haven't heard anybody else say, so I guess I'd like to say it, is that killing civilians in a war happens for one prime reason. The enemy hides their anti-aircraft guns in the civilian situation. And we had to go get those guns. And when we were told to go get those guns, we went to get those guns. We were never told in advance that this particular area, be it so far off of the airfield, was this or that. It was just a target.
Napalm, you could come down low, 50 feet, 100 feet off the ground, and come right along, and you could drop your napalm with great accuracy.
We'd dive down low, and we'd probably altitude 50 feet, which doesn't leave much room for error, for sure. Call it precision bombing or something. But we dropped 165 gallons of napalm at each time, and boy, you can't believe the fire would start.
When it's ignited and it hits something, it just sticks and burns. It's a jelly. Some of those napalm tanks were old Japanese belly tanks. Some of them were, the front end was dented, so you didn't have a smooth airfoil in it. You'd have to carry a little extra power to get up there.
Our squadron, 511, was trained to fly the aerial torpedo called Tiny Tim. In order to drop the Tiny Tim, which was a 1,100-pound torpedo, they had a rack built underneath it, and then that rack would drop down, and then the rocket wouldn't take off until it cleared the propeller.
You had it hung there, and it didn't fire till you dropped it. It had to get away from the aircraft, and then the lanyard would fire it. Normally, they'd all fire the same, and that thing would go straight. We were using those to close railroad tunnels. But once in a while, one side of that rocket would ignite and the other one wouldn't, and you had a rocket that took off at an angle.
I was picked to take photographs of a fellow dropping the Tiny Tim that I mentioned earlier, and he was supposed to drop no lower than 2,500 feet, and of course I had my cameras on, and I was flying behind him to take a picture of what that Tiny Tim did when it hit. I looked down at my altimeter, and he was already below 2,500 feet. So by the time I could pull up, I was at 700 feet and flew through his debris. Well, it peeled off a piece of the wing about 1 foot wide and maybe 2 foot long, and that thing was flapping in a breeze like a flag. I thought the whole airplane was coming apart. I called him up and said, "Thank you very much. You just shot me out of the air."
This one tunnel, I think they had 12 planes to close that tunnel. And we dropped everything from 500-pound bombs to 250-pound bombs. And one particular tunnel, I put a tiny TIM right in the entrance. And there was smoke and stuff came out the other side. But then we closed the tunnel. Went up there 2 days later, it's open again. And we never knew whether or not there was a train in there, because during the daytime, they'd put their motorized equipment and their rail cars in the tunnels, so we couldn't hit them. If we found a train out in the open, why, we'd take care of it.
It would depend on what the local terrain was. If there were mountains around it, that we would have to make sure that we had plenty of speed so we can get up over the mountains.
So the lead guy started tightening up his turn, and I could see he wasn't going to make it. So I put on more RPM and everything, so I could continue to watch him. And sure enough, he put on his power and everything too late. He flew into the ground. But he hit in such a manner that he knocked off his gas tank, all of his rockets, weeds and everything in his rocket launchers, and the airplane hit and did not catch his propeller. And with the full power and everything on there, he pulled up out of there and came on back to the carrier with no gas tank, no rocket. No, he landed it, yeah.
We had 250-pound frag bombs at the rocket stations, and that's what we had that day when we ran up on the people in white, and we dropped bombs on them, generally 2 at a time, and just wiped them all out. And I remember when Ray Reeder was making a report back to the ship, he said, "My God, we just wiped out a mess of Chinese," and he said, "There's bodies and blood all over the place." You know, it really was an unusual report.
The Marines were having a tough fight on I think the ridge was Old Bong Ni. I'm not sure, I could be wrong, but the North Koreans' strength were up there on the crest and on the back side, and our Marines were having a tough time with them. So they loaded up, I guess, 20 or so aircraft, 10 off of each carrier, with 1,000-pound bombs with variable time fuse, which meant that it could be set to explode in the air at whatever level above the ground you wanted. Then you get a wider coverage instead of having it go into the ground and make a hole in the ground. So we went along that Obong Ni Ridge, or whatever it was, with those 1,000-pound bombs. And after we dropped 20,000-pound bombs along that ridge, it was a heck of a lot easier for the grunts to continue their attack.
Sometimes we'd go looking for targets of opportunity, and I remember Les Brown and a fellow named Brown, and we had ordnance, and we caught a North Korean, or rather a Chinese army, coming around the mountain marching, and we just strafed them and dropped bombs on them, and they just kept coming. They were really, intent on what they were doing. But I remember Les Brown saying, "My goodness, I dropped a rocket and saw people disappear, and they just kept on coming. He just couldn't believe it." But that was unusual to find people moving like that.
So just before daylight, the Joint Operations Command called and asked us to go check these coordinates, because a night fighter had reported he dropped a bomb between some trains that were heading for a tunnel. The second section leader went down there and he found this bomb mark, and so he traced it all the way up to the cave, nothing. So then he turned around, went the other direction, and came down to a railroad intersection. And you talk about somebody excited, he said, "There's 4 complete freight trains down here in this intersection. Come on down." So we went down there, and we started our bombing runs at 6,000 feet. And by that time, it was getting just a little bit daylight. You could see something down there. And we were firing at them, and they were firing at us. Looked like Roman candles going down and Roman candles coming back up. What an exciting thing. And so I picked me out a railroad engine, and I dropped, and I pulled up and looked back, and the bomb hit just short of the railroad engine. I said, doggone it. I said, I'll give it a little bit. So we pulled on up and came back from the other direction, and I dropped my ordnance again, and I hit it in the same hole. So then we just strafed the trains and the cars, and of course the cars would be empty because they had delivered their supplies and they're on the way back to Pyongyang. And so I made a wide turn, and there's one more train left, about 2 miles from where we'd been bombing and strafing. And boy, he was just a scooting. So I told the major that I was flying with, I said, I'm going up here and stop this train. And I put my millimeters in the engine, and it stopped. Of course, couldn't go anyplace, didn't have. And so, boy, we got back to Cary, and we told those other pogues, we don't care who's scheduled for this hop. You guys are gone. We're going back up there, and we're going to go back. The Joint Operations Command took that target away from us. One of the most interesting targets we had the whole time we were there. They took that target away from it, and they bombed that thing all day long.
When we had the impasse up at the reservoir and were surrounded by the Chinese, well, I was a tactical air coordinator up there, and we had a R5D overhead controlling flights coming in from Japan, and then they'd give them to me, and I would say, well, I've got a group down here that needs some ordnance on it, and then I'd go mark it with our smoke rocket, and then they'd unload on them, and that was really effective.
I had been a sailor all of my life. We raced sailboats for years on Lake Pontchartrain in New Orleans. We were covering several cruiser task force where we were vectored out to destroy watercraft that sometimes were nothing but Japanese fishermen. And they were concerned that these watercraft were sending back information on the location of the cruiser task force, so we had to destroy them. And with 650 caliber machine guns, if you take a 100-foot long wooden boat under fire, you only see your target when you first open fire, because after that there's too much nothing but splash, and you see a board flying out here, a board flying out there, a piece flying out here, a piece flying out there, but you don't get to see the target the whole way through. 650 caliber machine guns converging is fantastic firepower, brutal firepower. And I didn't like the idea of shooting fellow seamen, so to speak. I loved the water, and that was hard to do.
We thought that our mechanics were just outstanding. Unfortunately, they didn't take care of our airplane. We got down to the South Pacific, and they went one direction, we went another. And they maintained the airplanes for quite a few squadrons, one of which was VF-17, who did a very good record, partially because of our maintenance.
We had the finest ground crew that ever operated in the South Pacific. Their main job, they got transferred to an island called Ondonga, where the Navy Squadron VF-17, and our boys took care of them, and they kept those planes almost 95% airborne every day.
Your ground crew would not always be with you. You'd have a flight echelon and the ground crew.
We lost our pilots. They moved to another island, but then we got another set of pilots, which turned out to be a BMF 214. That was Pappy Boyington's outfit. And we had them for about 3-4 months. We did pretty good, and we also had a Navy squadron coming that we took care of on Ondonga. That was VF-17. And the Navy had 36 Corsairs to the squadron, and the Marine Corps only carried 18.
So we had our hands full on Donga, and the Navy did pretty good. And they cleaned out a lot of Japs up there at Rabaul and Kavieng. And the skipper of that squadron was named Commander Blackburn.
Ground personnel did the most fantastic job of anybody in the squadron. They kept those planes going, and I mean, when they had to take one out of service, they would work all night long on it. The most dedicated group of people I've ever known. And gosh, if it hadn't been for them, I'd have been afraid to fly that thing.
Planes had 2 bomb shackles on them. And this day I was working on them. I don't remember what I was doing particularly, but when we shifted from one side to the other, we would lay over this auxiliary gas tank and slip between it and the propeller. And this particular day, when I slipped through there, a mechanic had gotten in the plane that I was not aware of, and just as I slipped through, he started the thing up. If my back end had been about 2 inches closer, why, I would have lost some weight, I'm sure.
With the airplanes, you have every 30 hours of flying time, you had to pull a check where you'd drain the oil and check the rocker boxes. If you walk around there, and you'd probably be looking at 3, 4 things at one time, you know, looking for holes or.
We'd usually go through the plane captain, who really was the liaison between us and the pilot. And if we'd see anything that we thought was, you know, going to be adverse to them going on another strike, we'd report that, and then they could handle it from there. And if it was something we could handle or help with, we helped too, you know, because we were all trying to get the strike up as quickly as possible.
And we check, especially the prop, see if they had any nicks in there.
It was my job simply to, after fixing a prop, is to run it up to full RPM, drop the props, change the pitch to see if it was a proper drop in RPMs.
Right where the wings hit the plane, that's a little dip in there. That's where I used to sleep, warm the plane up, and then in the evenings it got a little cool on the islands, and I used to sleep until they come around, okay, let's get going, and warm them up, and pilots would come in and tuck them in the cockpit there, and off they'd go. We spent the whole day laying around waiting for our pilots to come in, doing a little praying here and there. Then they'd come back maybe 4 or 5 hours later, and we'd take care of the plane, gas it up, and look it over for any holes and stuff.
I would say the biggest hit that I saw was a cable in the wing, probably 2 or 3 inches thick, the diameter, and it was shot in pieces.
There were no hoists that we could avail ourselves up to, so whenever a propeller had to be taken off the plane, I got up on the cowl, and after we loosened all the spanner nuts and the cone and the retainer nuts, I just had to put my feet up against that prop and just muscle it off. And when we got to the edge, I simply had to call about 4 or 5 guys to grab each end of one of those props and just muscle it off and then carry it into my shop. And that's when I did the work of, essentially was changing seals, because it was a hydraulic mechanism and seals occasionally do leak. And a prop being nicked badly through stones and various debris, in which case it had to be filed out and it had to be also taken off, because when you remove metal, it becomes unbalanced. So you had to balance this thing, and we did have a balancing mechanism.
We saw the planes, and they were just beautiful. They started showing me the old hands, how you put the rockets under the wings. But the first thing they did was they had a strike come back, and they were carrying, I think, a 500-pound bomb under the Corsair. And so we went over and the guy said, we'll have to take this bomb off. And they rolled a bomb dolly in under the plane, and one of them nodded to a guy in the cockpit, and he released the bomb and dropped it in the bomb dolly.
and my heart just about blowed out of my chest. I thought, you know, I didn't know anything about a bomb. I didn't know they had a fuse in them and they had already screwed it out. I figured the bomb was going to blow up and we were all going to be killed right there. But the thing finally quit bouncing and they all started laughing. And of course the joke was on me. And I got to pull that on some new guys later on.
You had to take the blade off, and it was a hollow core at the beginning, at the shaft end, and it was lead filings in there. Lead, actually it's like steel wool, and so you pounded some on the opposite end of on the one that you had to take some material off. And so you kind of spun it out, not spun it, but and if it went this way without any effort, then you knew it was too heavy on this end. So you had either had some balancing points on the other end. So it had to be balanced, and that was critical. And on the Corsair, it was a 13-foot plus prop, and that was very, very critical. Even if it was off a micro ounce, you'd be in serious trouble.
Ordnance officer and the master sergeant, they would be setting the fuses and everything for us, and then we'd install all of that and see that the flight got off, and then just stand at the ready to arm the planes again when they come back from that particular strike. And sometimes they'd do 4 and 5 strikes a day, so we were busy all the time.
We would move these planes around, hook them up, move them here, move them there. We would refuel them, so we would help each other out substantially. Because, you know, I wasn't changing propellers every day, just rarely, so you did pitch in.
We always were looking for misfire, you know, to see if all of our ordnance got off of the plane the way it should have, and we were always pleased with that when they come back with everything gone.
We had our ordnance guys come in, you know, picked up the ammunition. Then we had another crew come in, or a guy come in, check the oxygen. And then we had to make sure the radio man checked everything out. And when that plane was ready to go, everything had to be perfect.
They would work all night long to make sure that airplane, all of the airplanes in the squadron, were up to snuff and just working out just fine. They'd bore sight the guns at 300 yards, and man, they'd be right on target. You know, it was just magnificent.
These pilots really deserve the kind of credit because they were at the blunt force of any hostile action. They risked their lives, we didn't. And we held them in awe. They were just like gods. And you know, you don't pal around with God, you just kind of look at him in a great degree of wonderment that they're able to do what they did. But we know that they appreciate, I'm sure they appreciate what we've done.
Our squadron, the ground crew we had, from the planes we sent out, from our squadron, VMF 214 and VF 17, the Navy squadron, they shot down 310 Jap planes.
The Japanese in the night hauled some artillery up on the side of a mountain not far from us. And I don't know what the equivalent of their 75 gun was, but whatever it was, they were firing directly down onto our airplanes. So that evacuation was kind of interesting. You talk about traffic jams. We had about 40 Corsairs all trying to get off on a single runway at the same time, and every once in a while a shell would hit underneath one of those guys. He'd bounce up in the air. And being the CO at that time of that particular part of the squadron, we were split in 2 divisions. I stayed until the last airplane and got everybody else off, and it was a pretty old bird. It was splashing oil all over the windshield, and the wheels wouldn't come up and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, I flew it back down to Vella Lavella. We flew back there, and the runway down to Vella Lavella had the ocean on one side and a big hill on the other side, and I couldn't see anything except sidewise. And my wingman, Jack Quisenberry, just stood over here and just gradually lowered me down and told me when to cut, and it worked out fine.
We had bombers overhead. I remember in the evenings, we'd try to set up a little field movie, and had some little folding chairs we'd stick out under a tree and try to put it where the trees would shade it. You know, in the middle of the movie, it'd have an air raid.
We have a movie, and every night this Betty would come over the enemy airplane and drop bombs. And we dug ourselves a beautiful little foxhole, and we had a bench down in there and everything like that. And we'd go jump into the foxhole, and he'd go by and drop his bombs. And finally we said, oh, you know, he never hits anything. We just won't go in the foxhole this time. Well, no, first thing you know, you hear a little bang here and a big bang there, and the next bang is going to be right on top of you.
And they hit the bomb dump, and it was a hell of a crash there on Roy. They blew a hole. They said they haven't found the bottom of it yet.
When we joined them, we were having a meeting in this hut out by the runway in the back base, you know, back at Espiritu Santo, and I don't know if this was done purposely or not, but there was an explosion of some kind not too far away. And of course, all the veteran pilots dived under the tables and chairs and got on the floor. And there, we new boys, we sat there fat, dumb, and happy because we didn't realize that they were, you know, thought they were getting bombed. They dove for the floor.
Well, at one time, we were standing runway alert, 4 of us in airplanes, just in case the Japanese came down, we'd go up and oppose them. Well, from some distance away, not very far, they were firing at us. And I could see down the end of the runway, the bullet hit the ground, and not a bullet, a shell, hit the ground, and pretty soon another one. And they were walking down the runway right toward me. And about the time I figured about time I had better get out of there, I went and dove in a foxhole. And there was a dead Jap in the foxhole, all maggoty, covered in mildew and everything. I went in that foxhole and I jumped out as fast as I could.
The explosions of these missiles, shells, I could hear, you know, in the general area. And I waited there about 30 minutes in the foxhole, and then I figured, then it quieted down. So I figured I better get up and go check on the squadron. So I got out of the foxhole, and there wasn't another single person above ground yet. So then I started to turn to go into the tent to get dressed and go to the squadron. And just as I got 90 degrees to the 3 steps, I heard something go, boom, say, and it was a Japanese artillery shell, which hit the top of a tree behind my tent, and then exploded and sprayed shell fragments all down through the tent. And I felt something hit me. So I got back in the foxhole for a little while. And then I finally looked. I didn't hurt. I was hit just below the hip bone here. I looked, and all I could see was red meat. So then I drove myself to the field hospital, checked in, and eventually, of course, there are a lot of others in there wounded and far worse than I, but I was eventually put on an operating table and put under. That night, about midnight, I began to hurt, and I really hurt. So inadvertently and not wanting to, but still I made a few noises, and a corpsman came down the row, and he said, "What's the matter, sir?" And I said, "I hurt." He said, "Well, you can't have any more morphine." I said, "I don't want any more morphine." And he said, "Just a minute, sir." And he went back down the row, and then he returned, and he had a camp stool, folding camp stool, and he unfolded it, put it down by my bunk, and he reached up and he took hold of my hand and held my hand. And you know what a great degree of comfort that gave? I'll never forget that, Corpsman.
I was never on a base that was attacked by enemy aircraft. They tried to, but didn't get through to us.
The searchlights and the traces that went up over that island were just awesome. Awesome. I've never seen a fireworks display that came anywhere near it.
We were all taxiing out from our parking area to the runway, and they had made that probably a 1 mile distance time. We went around in circles to get to the runway. And before we got about halfway there, while there was a Jap bombing mission overhead, I stood up on the side of the cockpit and jumped. So I didn't look for the wing or anything. I just jumped straight out, which wasn't very far. And Okinawa had been quite wet the first month or 2 months of the operation there. So I was buried up to my knees in the mud and watched all the bombs fall around me. And one of the ground crew, when they all clear, first of all, they came out and helped me get out of the mud.
Roger Conant and I was walking down the runway one time at Bella La Bella. It was our day off. And an SBD came in with a bomb that wouldn't drop, and it was armed. And it went on down the runway by the gas trucks down there, and we were walking down the runway, and all of a sudden a terrific explosion occurred, killing 23 people. And if we had been 5 minutes later, I wouldn't be performing this interview with you.
And I remember one guy coming in who had taken off and hadn't gotten rid of his bomb load. And he came around and went back in before he had any chance to do anything. And he plowed in, and I mean, there was one heck of an explosion. Really mess. Fire.
We lost Rogers, was one of our guys.
Rogers was one of them that we lost that way.
You know, that night, that very night, an SBD dive bomber and a torpedo plane were trying to land at the same time on the bomber strip, and they hit. Whoop. I'll never forget that noise. Just whoop, and a huge blaze, and they went down.
Well, the Japanese would come down every night and bomb us. They'd have one they call him, what do we call him, washing machine Charlie. And he'd come down and he'd have his twin engine bomber, and what he'd do is take his engines out of the synchronization, and then it'd go zoom, 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 and just to keep the pilots awake at night, our crew awake. So as a result, we didn't have any night fighters to go after him at all. The AA would light up in the big floods, would try to knock him down, but they never did. But one time he'd always drop a bomb before he left. He dropped this bomb on an old Japanese ammo dump, which was right close to our camp. And this thing started going off, and we had shells flying all over the place. They put holes in the Quonset, and we were into these foxholes and underground for 2 or 3 days with this ammo all going off.
And I lost the one where I hit the half track on the runway, knocked the wheel off on the pre-dawn on a radar pickup patrol, flew 4.5 hours, radio silence. The best compliment I got on that flight was, outside of confirming some kills and a Baka bomb, was Colonel Munn, who retired as a lieutenant general. Pappy was chewing me out for not flying down the middle of the runway. And Colonel Munn come up and shook my hand and said, "That's the damnedest best radio discipline I've ever seen in my life." Because I never said a word, because we'd have raids coming in, and you don't talk. The radio discipline is pretty serious stuff.
And one guy was landing, and by this time we're down on the ground. We're sitting on a palm tree, watching the rest of these people coming in, limp and bad trouble and whatnot. One guy forgot to unarm his guns, and he came down and pulled his stick back and fired the machine guns down the runway. And we jumped off the runway pretty fast.
That mission on New Year's Day of '44, one of these B-24s that was crippled decided to make an emergency landing on the fighter strip on Bougainville. And my flight leader at the time, he had gone back early. This happened before I got back there. He was landing the correct way into the wind and this 24 was coming in emergency, just trying to get it on the ground. And they came so close to colliding that when my flight leader rolled under the 24, the one wheel on the 24 took the canopy off over his head. That's how close they came to getting it on the ground there.
We were just sitting there, and all of a sudden the screeching on, looked up, and both saw the plane skidding on his belly and sparks flying up. Just pulled up and skidded to a halt, and when it did, that pilot, he didn't even touch the airplane. He just leaped out, and when it started burning, all those 50 caliber machine guns, God, it just started popping, going off. Got to be kind of a noisy thing. That it wasn't safe to go out there with a fire truck until all the ammunition quit exploding, to put the fire out.
Yantan was a beautiful field, a great big airfield with many runways. They moved us from there to Shimu, which was a strip And the strip that you move had a saucer in the middle. In other words, it went like this. And there was a lot of controversy. One end of the strip was out virtually over the water, very close to the water edge. The other one dipped down and then had a rather large hill come up behind it. And there was always a debate as to whether or not there were certain wind conditions that this created that made it hazardous when you came in, slowing as much as you could in order to land, or whether it was a visual problem that in making that approach, you looked at the hill and thought the hill was higher than the end of the runway, which would have been a depth perception problem. And we lost an awful lot of people who piled into that end of the runway.
On the mat down there on Macon, there was a place where by the tower where the truck used to cross. And that was about the point where you got to the takeoff point, and so it was a matter of whether you go ahead and lift off and stagger along, or else get bounced in the air about where the automobiles or trucks cross the runway.
If anybody has never been on a board of a carrier when the landings and taking off, it's one of the most exciting places in the world.
Catapult is fairly easy because what it does, it throws you out there, and when you reach the end of the deck, you're doing about 75 to 77 knots. She'll sink a little bit, and then you're at full power, and then you pull back, and you may drop a little bit, but you pull out.
For takeoff, the starboard cat was 75 feet, and the port cat was 85 feet. And I always seemed to get the starboard cat. But anyway, it gave you enough power it gave you enough of a jolt to get you airborne with everything you needed. But you sure hoped that your 18 cylinders were all putting out.
I was spotted on the starboard first catapult, and the quietest moment of my life, they fired me off and the engine stopped. And I'm going like this, and I could feel that carrier was catching up on me. And just before I hit the water, that big old 14-foot prop started spinning and flew water up on the hangar deck, and I managed to go over and land. And that was kind of a fun situation.
I was doing qualifications on the old FDR. I had a war-weary airplane, but you know you can't stop, and you know you're not going to make it. And I just dribbled off the deck, and I was the second plane off. He was not settled good into the wind. I did not have good wind. I got in slipstream, and it just put me right down in the water. And I was not harmed. I was back on deck, and I was master sergeant, matter of fact, then. I was back on deck in 14 minutes, and I jumped out of the chopper. I was living in chief quarters. I jumped out of the chopper on the opposite side of the medics and run down and jumped in the shower, and nobody knew where I was. And the old man was calling for me, where is this pilot, you know? Captain's aide was running all over trying to find where was that guy. And they found me, and they took me up to the bridge, or they went right back to operations. And I remember I threw the skipper a highball, and I'm standing there absolutely starched. I mean, absolutely creased. I hadn't even sat down yet. With my starched 4.5 cap, that's not what we called it, but 4.5 cap. And he just absolutely stunned, and he couldn't believe it. He just sat there and shook his head, and that was me, you know. Matter of fact, skipper saw so much of that incident of the Roosevelt. All the planes were launched the next day, and he asked me, do I want to finish my qualification? And I said yes. That's not exactly the way I said it, but I said yes. And I said, hell yes. And so he launched everything, and he stayed in the wind. He stayed in the wind. For me, I'm the only plane in the pattern, and I've got my 8 landings. My 8 landings, boom, 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 boom. And I got a pat on the back. He says, you're okay.
There was ice on the deck, and it was on a day where the carrier was going like this, you know, up and like that. And so there I was, taxiing forward with the power off, and you still had 750 RPM. And the airplane started sliding, and I realized I cut the engine off so I didn't have any RPM. And the airplane skidded up, and the edge of the carrier's got a steel lip about this high, and about half an inch or so thick. When I jumped out of that airplane, when it stopped, the left wheel was on top of that piece of steel. So then when it went like that, of course, they skidded off of it, and that's when I jumped out of it, got in the catwalk, and they came and got up the tractor.
During the 2 years I was in the carrier squadron, I flew on 5 different carriers. 3 of them were Jeep carriers, one the Rendova, the Bairoko, and the Bedouin Strait. These were CBE carriers, and it was the CBE Class 105, Cape Gloucester.
The Boxer and the Antietam and Bedouin Strait, which is a little one, and Rendova, which is a little one. I think I had about 10 to 12 carriers, and, throughout my career.
We had an opportunity when the entire group went aboard to fly off of the Boxer and the Shangri-La. These were CVs, and they were the big ones, and we could actually do a deck launch. The CVEs, 95% of our launches were catapult because the carrier deck was only 485 feet long.
On a pre-dawn launch with no horizon, and you're going off, and the carrier is really humping to get 17 knots, which is the minimum. You hope that you're getting a full slug, in the catapult. So, but that's the, I don't know which is more interesting, the takeoff or the landing. The landing, if you've got a little bit of wind, it's no problem even on the little carrier, because you've got about 250 feet of landing area. You approach, you're hitting about 75 to 80 knots, and you come up to the LSO and you're right on speed, and then he cuts you and you get down, and that 250 feet goes by in a hurry.
Landings are a normal thing, but I think carrier landings are unusual. In a carrier landing, you're using minimum speeds in your approach, and you're following directions, and you're jeopardizing yourself and several hundred men, or maybe a couple of thousand on the carrier.
I had about 250 carrier landings. I don't know, maybe I had 75 or 80 on the Sicily.
Squadron would come in, and then a division would break off and let down to, I think, 1,000 feet. Maybe one would come down to 1,500 feet and then would go to 1,000. And you'd always follow the other lead plane around. And then when you came in over the ship, it was your turn to land. So they wanted to get at least a plane on the deck every 30 seconds. So you'd follow the lead plane, and then you'd break off and make your turn. And then when you came abreast of the ship, then you start turning in, and you had to judge it. It was a real instinctive thing to get the relative motion between the airplane and the ship moving.
You fly down the right side of the carrier to the right of the island, and they'll give you what was called a Charlie signal, which means okay to come aboard. You go out in front of the carrier, and then you go ahead and do a crosswind, and the carrier deck is about 90 feet off the water. So when you do your crosswind, you slowly get the Corsair down to about 150, 160 feet over the water, and you start really slowing it down.
The Corsair was a marvelous carrier plane because of that bent wing. You're sitting here, and the bent wing is right there, and the landing signal officer is standing right where he's standing. And you can see him all the way around in that approach.
Corsair has capability of dropping 60 degrees flaps, full down. You go ahead and put your tail hook down, your arresting gear down, and you put your gear down. And then you've got this all accomplished by the time you get on your downwind leg.
Corsair had excellent control at low speeds, near its stalling speeds.
You make your turn into the crosswind right at the end of the carrier. You see, the carrier is moving somewhere around 17 to 20 knots, and so really you're stretching it out. You do your crosswind, get down to about 90 knots, and then you start, the LSO will pick you up on the crosswind, and he gets you the paddles.
He's on the port side of the stern of the ship, and you're making a left turn into that aircraft carrier.
And if you know the pattern, you follow the pattern, and you can see him better than you can from any other airplane. He's not going to get covered up by their wing. He's standing in your dip there.
Corsair quits at about 76 knots, and they like to have you about 2 to 4 knots above stall speed when you come down. You've got to be able to power that airplane up. So with 60 degrees of flaps, the gear down, and your tail hook down, and you're cocked up, you're usually carrying about 75% of horsepower.
And I always tried to keep the top part of the control tower a little bit above the horizon and go on up, and I would mechanically set my manifold pressure at about 23 to 24 inches. And with your prop already set for 2700, you would generate about 2300 to 2350 RPM, and that would give you about 93 miles an hour, or knots, 93 knots, which would be about 6 or 7 knots above stalling speed. And so then you just flew the airplane along, and I would be going downwind at the carrier, and you have to judge how far away from the carrier you are by the amount of turn you have to make in order to get back in and confront the back end of the carrier to come in there. And I'd always start my turn when I reached the island. And the time I continued on, and from that point, made a gentle turn and flew right in towards the end of the carrier, looking at the landing signal officer, but more or less lining myself up with the deck and coming on around in there. And I don't know how they did it, that's how I did it.
It had a very high, well, it had a high torque ratio. And coming aboard ship, which was always a lot of fun, instead of putting it in full low pitch, we used to put it, I think, 2800 RPM. So if you ever got a wave off and you push the power to it, otherwise the airplane would just roll on you.
This is a Roger signal. This is a fast, you're too fast. Of course, this is high, and this is too low. And come on, you need more airspeed, you're getting too slow. And then just a plain cut like that is your cut signal.
So you just get in that pattern and keep that guy on the kink in your wing until he says cut, and you're on. You can go to sleep then.
Every landing was an arrested landing.
Landing signal officer stands out there, and if he's got the flags like this, that's Roger. I mean, just keep coming like you are. And I made 2 cruises with him standing there like that until I presented myself at the proper place, and he gave the cut sign, and I was going to make my landings. And there were several other people that got skills, and he kept track of how each pilot was doing, and he drew a little man on a chart back there, and if he had a signal he had to give you, high or low or too slow or fast or whatever, he would have that down beside your name, and the guy that had the cleanest bodies up there, he'd give him a bottle of booze. Well, I didn't drink, so I'd give my bottle to somebody else.
Also, coming aboard ship with that, they used to call it the hose nose, and coming aboard ship so you could keep your eye on the LSO, you'd have full right rudder on. And then as you came over and you got the cut, you'd release your rudder, drop the stick, and you were down.
I was landing signal officer. I was bringing them aboard too. And every now and then you'd get one go into the fence or into the catwalk or something.
The LSO will give you a cut, and then what you do is just dip and pull back, and you got 3 wires. You try for the first or second. You can catch the third, but if you miss the third, you're in the barriers. The barrier is just another set of arresting gear wires that is just popped up, and it wraps around the prop and wraps around the wings.
Well, I didn't make a hard landing, but I caught the number 6 wire. And the run out on a Corsair was about 125, 127 feet.
And if his hook doesn't snag a wire, he keeps going into the barrier. And that generally messes an airplane up.
In the small carrier, they would not drop any barriers. But the larger carriers had 5 barriers, 3 up front and then another 2 for safety. And even though they had 3 barriers and I had caught a wire, they wouldn't drop it. So I went up and caught the barrier, and I went all the way up like this. Next thing I know, I'm looking down at the deck like that. The airplane flopped back. And then after that, they checked out our landing signal officer so that he had it where the airplanes were not making hard landings like that. And that was unfortunate, because I forget how many airplanes we creamed on that cruise. Probably 8 or 10.
Coming aboard, you'd step into him maybe and make him get over. And I stepped into him, and he just rolled up tighter, And by gosh, I had to get out of the way, and I cut him and jumped in the net, and he ended up in the catwalk.
The small carriers, they are affected by the swells. Your nose is going to drop right away. You cut your power off. And you have to look and see, is the deck coming up or it's going down if you have one of those days where they got swells. It's not too bad if you're going into the swells perpendicularly. But if you're going into swells on an angle, the carrier would be coming up and going down. And so not only did you have to check into the carrier coming forward, you didn't want to land, you wanted to land 3-point, or otherwise you drive one wheel through the wing. So you had to twist your airplane to hit the 3-point no matter which way it was going.
Even though we land-based Marines weren't flying from a carrier, we still did that turning approach, which was the best approach if you're going to be as slow as they wanted us to land, and you want to be at the end of the runway. You see, the object is to come in as slow as you can and to hit the end of the runway where possible. As close to, safe, close to the end of the runway. Stalled, and you want to make a 3-point landing. And if you really get it, if it's a hot day for you, you can even do a little tail first.
Come in and make an approach about 1,500 feet and turn downwind, and you would put down 30 degrees flaps and lower the landing gear, and then as you come into the straightaway, you would lower the flaps to 60 degrees, slow your speed up to about, initially 90 knots.
I don't know, you mean what RPM? I can't remember. That was 60 years ago.
It's an easy to land airplane except in a crosswind. As you can see, the gull wings, you have one or the other wing into the wind. It's like a real weather vane.
I never landed this plane straight away. You always hang it on the prop, full flaps, unless you got a lot of wind. Full flaps, and just feed it down with the propeller, and it pays off right on the runway. And if you don't do that, you're dangerous. The Corsair has got to be on the ground with no flight speed. If you got flight speed and you're still on the ground, you're in bad shape. It's got to really pay off. And when it landed, it settled right down. You didn't have to worry about it bouncing.